The third meeting of the 62nd session of the Commission for Social Development is called to order. I now invite the Commission to continue its consideration of Agenda Item 3A, entitled Priority Theme, Fostering Social Development and Social Justice through Social Policies to Accelerate Progress on the Implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and to achieve the overarching goal of poverty eradication, in order to hold a high-level panel discussion on the priority theme. I am pleased to welcome the distinguished panelists for our high-level panel discussion on the priority theme this afternoon. Her Excellency, Valerie Berset-Burcher, Head of International Labour Affairs, the Labour Directorate at the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs of Switzerland. Ms. Eleni Nicolaidou, Director of Development Cooperation Policy at Hellenic Aid of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece. Ms. Gloria Reyes, the General Director of the Superit Program at the Presidency of the Dominican Republic, and Ms. Sabina Alkaya, Professor and Director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at the University of Oxford. I'm also pleased to welcome the moderator, His Excellency Danilo Turk, President of Club de Madrid and former President of the Republic of Slovenia. To begin our discussions, I have the pleasure to welcome the distinguished keynote speaker, Ms. Nora Lustig, Samuel Z. Stone, Professor of Latin American Economics and Founding Director of the Commitment to Equity Initiative at Tulane University, who is joining via virtual connection. I will now invite Ms. Lustig to address the Commission.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking you, Madam Chair, for your kind words, and also the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs for inviting me to this important session. And I'm very pleased to share this session with such distinguished members of the panel. I hope everybody can hear me, and I apologize for not being there in person. I am connected from Monterrey, Mexico, and I hope everything will go smoothly. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
I assume the answer is yes. Anyway, so I wanted to discuss today something that's very important when we think about assembling social policies to attain the goals of poverty reduction and also inequality reduction, as they have now been incorporated into the SDGs full-fledged. And there's several messages that I want to leave with everybody today. One is that when we think of social policies, it's very important also to think on the about the revenue-raising side. It's very important to think about not only social policies, but also tax policy for the achievement of the goals. And I hope to convince you in a little bit why. What I'm going to show you today is that although fiscal policy, the combination of taxes and transfers, reduces inequality throughout the world in all the countries that we've been able to study in different degrees, the problem is that in a number of countries, fiscal policy increases poverty. And I will explain in a little bit how that is possible. I know a lot of people find that peculiar, but it is a problem that we need to really focus, because as we move forward, emphasizing domestic resource mobilization to fund the social policy that's needed to achieve the goals, or we think about introducing universal programs, we're going to face an issue that has to do with the extent to which fiscal policy may even worsen the condition of increasing poverty among the already poor or making non-poor poor as a result. So let me start, first of all, by sharing this here, the type of work that we do at the Commitment to Equity Institute at Tulane. We what's called fiscal incidence analysis, which is a method to allocate taxes and transfers to households so we can measure quantitatively the extent to which fiscal policy reduces inequality and poverty. We've covered more than 70 countries around the world. You can visit us at this website. Everything that's published there is for free, even the books that have been published and articles that have been published, thanks to support from several donors. We've been able to make everything open source. And about 3-4 years ago, led by initially Oxfam and with the World Bank, we proposed the introduction of a new indicator in the SDG menu that's called the Fiscal Redistribution Indicator, that's now been submitted as part of the official monitoring of progress of SDG 10.4, and it's indicator SDG 10.4.2 that for the first time allows to assess the extent to which fiscal policy is addressing inequality. I hope that in the future we'll be able to add the indicator for poverty. We use this common methodology, and like I said, for anybody who's interested, these are available for free. Those are handbooks for people who want to replicate the studies that we've done so far. And let me quickly tell you what we do. It's very simple. We have what people receive from their labor income, from their self-employed, for people who are richer from capital income. And then, we subtract the direct taxes, the personal income tax, property taxes, etc., and we add the direct cash transfers and near cash transfers. We get to something called disposable income. Very importantly, our work includes the next stage, which is, well, in many countries, there are subsidies on energy consumption, for example, or food consumption. And practically in all countries, you have some form of tax on consumption, which reduces the ability of people to use disposable income to buy goods and services because part of that disposable income goes to taxes. So after we add the indirect subsidies when they exist and subtract indirect taxes, we get to something called consumable income. The indicator used for SDG 10.4.2 compares inequality measured by the Gini coefficient with market income and consumable income. So the difference between those two, if this Gini coefficient is lower than the one for market income, then inequality would have fallen. We also try to monetize the benefits in the form of services in kind, particularly in education and health, and so we obtain something called final income. But I'm going to be focusing primarily on what happens with the SDG 10.42, so looking at market income to consumable income. So what's happened based on our data, which includes, at this point, over 60 countries, 66 to be precise. So first question, does fiscal policy reduce inequality? Yes. For all the 66 countries of which we have this indicator, inequality falls. However, there's large variation. So here I show you the 66 countries of which we have collected the indicator, or rather calculated the indicator. And by the way, this is calculated by many different teams. It's not a couple of people. There's hundreds of people involved in this. And as you can see, well, the smallest one in our current ranking is Cambodia, and the largest one is Spain. And as I said, there's a lot of discrepancy, even for countries that start with the same pre-fiscal income inequality. These are measures of inequality. And the diagonal tells you that every point that's below the diagonal, it means that the post-fiscal income inequality is lower. Fiscal policy has reduced inequality. All the countries are below the diagonal, as I said earlier. But look, for example, here we have countries that start with similar pre-fiscal and end in different post-fiscal. For example, this country here has a much higher, much higher post-fiscal than this one. I think this is Argentina, this is Peru. So you can have a wide discrepancy even when you start with similar levels of initial inequality that reflect the effort made by the countries to reduce inequality. Let me give you a caveat though. As we know, Argentina is in dire straits. It's a country that is facing severe fiscal crisis because it has spent too much. So the fact that it was able to reduce inequality by much more than Peru, given that it's not sustainable, is not necessarily something to be praised. We want countries that are able to do it sustainably. Uruguay versus here is, I think this one is Ecuador, is a good example because it has been able to reduce inequality by more than its peers in terms of pre-fiscal inequality, but it doesn't face issues of prices, so it's been able to do it sustainably. So the next question I asked is, well, do more unequal countries spend more? We would like to see a greater effort in countries, the more unequal they are, in terms of uh, allocating resources to programs that reduce inequality. The answer is yes. The fact that this dotted red line has a positive slope tells me that overall, in the aggregate, more unequal countries spend less on social spending, spend more on social spending, which means that they can produce greater resources available for reduction of inequality. The next question, okay, they spend more, but do they have a larger redistributive effect? Yes, again, the slope here is positive, so it means that countries that spend more are able to achieve a larger redistributive effect, which we're measuring here. And the next question is, do more unequal countries have a larger redistributive effect? We do want to see that. By the way, the answer today is yes, but historically it was not always the case. Before the sort of great developments in the 20th century in terms of increasing the reach of welfare programs, the relationship was not necessarily positive. Again, the fact that we have a positive slope here with a red line tells us that more unequal countries are able to obtain greater redistribution. But again, there's a lot of heterogeneity. There are countries that are very high, countries that are very low here. So this is the average, but the average tells us good news. So when you look at the different type of fiscal interventions that the state has to introduce changes in inequality, we want to know which ones are equalizing, which ones are not. Overall, in all the countries that we've studied, direct taxes tend to be equalizing, are equalizing throughout, I should say. Direct transfers are equalizing throughout. Interestingly, indirect taxes like VAT, excise taxes combined in many countries are equalizing. They're not necessarily regressive. And indirect subsidies, they're also equalizing in many countries. Education and health spending, as expected, and thank goodness, are also equalizing. So when we look at the inequality patterns, in general, the results tend to be uh, okay in the sense that there are countries in which even though inequality falls, it is small, but we don't find anything startling or worrying. Where the concern starts is when we move in the direction of what happens to poverty. Does fiscal policy reduce poverty? No, not in all countries. When I measure poverty, again, I'm going to compare pre-fiscal income, market income, with consumable income that will include, very importantly, the effect of indirect taxes on consumption, such as value-added tax, excise taxes, etc. So all the countries in which the bars are above the zero means that post-fiscal poverty is higher than pre-fiscal one. This is not over time. This is before after, okay? All the countries in which the bars are below the zero line, then poverty has declined. But look at how many countries poverty increases. And unfortunately, we do have many countries that are in the low income category, like in sub-Saharan Africa, where this issue arises. And that is of great concern. So here, this is a way to look at it differently. And the reason why I present this is because often people think, okay, I am going to see what happens after direct taxes and direct transfers. They're always poverty decreasing, as we see in the blue lines here. Always the blue lines are below zero, except in this country, which I think is Egypt. No, sorry, all are blue. And what happens when I include consumption taxes in a bunch of countries? My poverty increases. So the bottom line, again, very importantly, is when we address social policies and we think about how to fund them, we have to be very careful that we don't take away what we give with the right hand with the left hand. If you think about, for example, providing universal programs in order to avoid any issues of leaving people out of social programs, the work that we have done at my institute has shown that frequently when you try to use the same amount of resources that you're spending today and spread them thin, the amount of poverty reduction that you're going to reach is rather small. If you want to keep the amount of poverty reduction or even make it bigger, then the amount of additional funds that you would need to raise through the tax system in many countries is not feasible. And in some countries, it's so high that it would be an uproar. So thinking about social policies and how to expand them, right now, I've been talking about income poverty. One of our co-panelists, Sabina Alcar, is going to talk about multidimensional poverty that also needs to be financed. When you think about the whole package, we have to really focus on how it's going to be funded. For many countries, the achievement of the SDGs on the poverty front will definitely require to rely on external sources for quite some time. Otherwise, what you're going to end up doing, you may be expanding things on the social policies front, but in order to fund it, you're probably going to have to generate additional revenues that are going to make the poor poorer. And so, very importantly, let's look at both sides of the ledger, the spending on social programs and what you need to use to finance it. And also, when we analyze what the impact of fiscal policy is of any reforms that we suggest, let's also not just look at what it does to inequality, let's also look at what it does to poverty. Thank you very much.
I thank Ms. Lustig for her keynote address. I will now turn the meeting over to the moderator, Mr. Danilo Turk, to conduct the proceedings of the panel discussion on the priority theme, and I look forward to a productive and interesting exchange of views. Before I hand over the floor, I wish to remind the panelists to please keep within their allotted time limit of 12 minutes per presentation, and to delegations to please keep within the 3-minute time limit during the interactive discussion. I thank participants for their understanding. Over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Warm welcome to you and my sincere appreciation for being here, and congratulations for your efficient handling and leading the session of the Commission for Social Development. I feel very privileged and honored to have the opportunity to moderate this afternoon's discussion and lead a dialogue of a matter which is of paramount importance: how social policies can become more effective to achieve inclusive, resilient and equitable societies, societies that leave no one behind. A very ambitious aspiration. As we gather here today, we recognize the critical role that effective and inclusive social policies play in promoting access to fundamental services, enhancing upward mobility, and at the same time, despite the improvements that exist in policies that have been put in place before, we understand that there is much more to be done, and that the issues of development and social policies are among the most critical, open questions for most societies around the world. The 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development has set a visionary path towards a just, equitable, and socially inclusive world where the needs of the most vulnerable people are met. And as I was reading the agenda when it first was adopted, I was reminded of discussions in which I participated in 1995 at the first World Social Development Summit in Copenhagen, its declaration, its program of action, its commitments, and I have seen how much progress has been made, but how very far from the aspirations already set in 1995 we still are. Effective and inclusive social policies promote access to fundamental services such as quality education, healthcare, clean water, sanitation, electricity, and in so doing advance well-being, promote resilience and upward mobility, and foster social justice for all. Now, the question that arises in this situation is the question really relating to the realities of our time. We see data that about 4 billion people have no social protection at all, and that 60% of workers are working in the informal sector. So when we learned this, when we heard this very powerful keynote speech by Professor Nora Lustig, I'm sure we're thinking about such data as well. 60% of workers in the informal sector, 4 billion people have no social protection at all. And 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt servicing than on healthcare systems. So the realities of today are stark, and designing social policies and making them effective is not an easy task. It is one of the most difficult tasks. We believe that we, meaning the Club de Madrid and other organizations in which I work, the particular attention must be paid to developing countries which face staggering set of challenges, including widespread poverty, high inequality levels, and pressing social needs related to healthcare, environmental stability, and social policy making in general. And obviously, the question of increasing fiscal space for policy making is vitally important. It is important to base our analysis on facts as they are, and to realize that business as usual approach risks widening existing gaps and leave a growing share of people behind. Inequality in access to fundamental social services such as education, healthcare, and social protection exacerbates power asymmetries, weakens social cohesion, and undermines trust. In other words, producing serious political problems. As the global community turns its attention to managing current multiple interconnected crises and the necessary resilient recovery, it is incumbent upon us to build on the lessons and failures which were learned in the past and renew our commitment not only to leave no one behind, but to rethink social development, build upon a concept of what we in Club de Madrid, the organization of former presidents and prime ministers, 120 people from 70 countries from all regions of the world, of what we term as shared societies. This envisions society characterized by social cohesion, in which people hold an equal capacity to participate in, to benefit from economic, political and social opportunities, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, language, or other attributes. And let me highlight that we will not advance on social development without making progress towards and eventually achieving gender equality. Ignoring or marginalizing women in social development limits the potential for comprehensive and lasting progress. And it is very disturbing when we hear information, when we learn about the fact that the pre-pandemic gender income gap has actually worsened during the recent COVID-19 pandemic. And according to some estimates, it will take about 70 years to close that gender gap. That is clearly not a future that we wish. And again, the question of effective social policies come into that picture very directly. Now, we live in a time of global changes, not only pandemic, which I referred to, but also prevalence of violent conflicts and other challenges related to the climate emergency, rapid technological advancement, and all this calls for urgent action in different areas. We need fundamental shifts, shifts that would lead to greater commitment to solidarity and action. Today, we shall have an opportunity to make a contribution to this. We shall have, in addition to a very persuasive and powerful keynote speech, 4 panelists who will tell us about various ways in which progress in the future should be made. The journey towards building societies that leave no one behind is a shared responsibility and requires collaboration, innovation, and long-lasting commitment to placing the well-being of our people in the forefront of development agenda. And it requires action, and that also, I hope, will be addressed during this panel discussion. Let us use this discussion as a catalyst of change and making a real contribution to that much-needed change. As I said, we have 4 panelists, and I will now give the floor them in the sequence in which they are presented in the program of our panel this afternoon. The first speaker on my list is Her Excellency Ms. Valérie Berchet-Birscher, Head of International Labor Affairs, Labor Directorate, State Secretary for Economic Affairs of Switzerland. You have the floor, madam.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Moderator. I will be speaking French. Good afternoon, everyone. As was mentioned this morning, we have 6 years left to achieve the 2030 Agenda, and the world is facing unprecedented challenges. In the current context, where we're seeing challenge after challenge, often overlapping, it's increasingly important to continue our commitment to social progress, multilateralism, and sound policy. As was mentioned before, inequalities in the world taking on extreme proportions. This social injustice disproportionately affects the most vulnerable, especially women, youth, persons with disabilities. The consequences of these inequalities are harmful, and they are becoming a political poison that weakens social cohesion and tarnishes democratic institutions. There can be no social justice without respect for human rights, social protections, and guarantees of fundamental freedoms. And that is why we must commit to creating opportunity for the most underprivileged to improve their well-being, their quality of life, and to guarantee gender equality and equal access to rights. As in other European countries, Switzerland is affected by digital transitions, as well as the environmental, economic, and demographic transitions affecting the labor market. We must therefore continue to place the human being at the center of our concerns. First of all, labor productivity is pivotal, and that's why we must continue to focus on creating strong economic conditions that can contribute to open markets, a favorable investment climate, competition, and openness to progress. A productive economy is better able to adapt to various transitions and shocks. In the context of the current deficit in the labor force that many European countries are facing, it is crucial to make better use of the potential of all qualified labor available in our countries. And here, of course, I'm thinking of all the measures that could help reconcile family life with professional life. This is an important starting point. Men and women must have the same opportunities to pursue their careers, regardless of the family structure. This goal can be achieved by creating a favorable environment for the family, including adequate, high-quality, and affordable childcare options. In addition, flexible forms of employment and tax regulations that can make labor more attractive are also key prerequisites. My government will soon be submitting to Parliament a proposal to introduce individual taxation of married couples at all state levels. This reform aims to encourage a second income in households, often that of the woman. In addition, it is important to keep older workers employed and to incorporate the unemployed that are more than 50 years old into the labor market because they, of course, face a higher risk of unemployment in the long term. The support measures that we are proposing aim to increase their competitiveness and to improve their skills and provide them with lifelong learning opportunities. We have measures to encourage the working population to continue to learn throughout their careers to acquire the skills needed in an increasingly demanding job market. And here it is very important to take into account the needs of the economy in teaching and professional training. We also need an education system that can take into account the needs of the economy and the individual. Important factors here include flexibility and porousness in the education system, which we have established with channels linking professional training and academic training. We also have permanent mechanisms for upskilling, as well as strong involvement by social partners in the government, as well as in financing of training. And these are all very important factors. And lastly, I want to talk about one particular measure that my country is currently implementing based on a popular initiative. You know that our country is one of a direct democracy. So there was a grassroots initiative voted on in Switzerland which aims to strengthen the nursing profession. And it was adopted after the COVID-19 pandemic. At the federal and cantonal level, we now must ensure that there are sufficient numbers of qualified nurses. In May 2022, our government launched a training offensive. So I'm talking here about education and training as a key part of our measures. By spring of this year, we will propose a new federal law and additional measures to improve working conditions in this sector, which is currently being discussed in one of this Commission's resolutions. And the goal will be to reduce the number of people who are leaving this profession prematurely. It is, after all, a very demanding profession, and we want to improve their conditions of work. Lastly, at the international level, it is important to create a virtuous circle between social policy and inclusive economic growth. Here I would like to speak about several elements that have helped to reconcile our social and economic goals. First of all, the social partnership and negotiation between social partners through a robust social dialogue. This is extremely helpful for addressing economic and social issues, as well as to promote good governance and to foster social harmony while stimulating the economy. In my country, all of these measures that have been put into place, we have social partners that are consistently consulted. Secondly, we have regulation impact assessments, a measure that's easy to put in place. And this means that all legislative drafts will be analyzed based on the potential impact. And this includes economic but also social and environmental impacts. This procedure has been proven to be effective. It guarantees that key aspects, including social consequences, can be sufficiently addressed at an early stage and appropriately in all draft legislation. And lastly, our legislation provides for rigorous social criteria when it comes to taking part in public markets. This ensures that public spending is in line with fundamental rights and contributes to social development. Inequality in the world, in the context of climate change, as was mentioned before today, have become some of the worst scourges of our times that need to be dealt with commonly. And so we need to encourage a just transition that aims to bring about structural change toward a neutral, inclusive, and egalitarian social and economic climate. This guarantees the importance of inclusive transition based on human rights. And here again, I'd like to focus on developing skills and learning focused on the green economy adapted to local job markets. As we know, the drafting and implementation of policies to promote a just transition must be the culmination of broad social consensus. It is true that a just transition will require net job creation, but it also will have major impacts on certain professions. We are committed to a tradition of social dialogue, and we are therefore convinced that there are many advantages and benefits of social dialogue to support an environmental transition. Lastly, on the international level, I'd like to mention our priorities here. First of all, we ought to place greater importance on harmony between policies within international organizations. We strive to encourage compliance with international labor norms, as well as a just transition at the interministerial level, in order to incorporate provisions on the just transition in national policies to achieve the SDGs. On the multilateral level, we continue to encourage policy coherence. It is more important than ever that the multilateral system espouse a set of common goals. Social justice must become a foundation for multilateralism and a unifying goal, as well as a powerful tool for a multilateral system that can be more effective and that can guarantee coherent policies. Social justice is at the heart of the priority theme for this commission. It promotes justice and equity in various aspects of society and is a twofold tool for, on one hand, promoting equal opportunity when it comes to the economics, educational, and world labor level, and also to reduce poverty, inequality, and discrimination throughout the world. And that is why my country has joined the ILO initiative for a global coalition for social justice. Social justice requires the mobilization of the entire multilateral system. This includes the UN, development banks, the World Bank, the IMF, in order to pool all of our efforts. And in this regard, Switzerland will be holding a side event this year on this global coalition, which is co-sponsored by Finland. And you are cordially invited this Thursday, February 8th at 1:15 p.m. in Conference Room 6 to talk about what we mean by political cohesion between different institutions of the UN system and world finance. Thank you.
I thank Mrs. Valerie Berset-Bircher for her very powerful and very interesting statement in which she emphasized such important values and innovations as the virtuous circle, including the mechanism of social partnership and impact of legislative achievements. Very interesting and very important instruments of developing appropriate social policies. And of course, I think everybody noticed the emphasis on the social justice that should become the basis for multilateralism. Well, I hope we shall make a contribution this time. I now give the floor to the next panelist on our list, Madam Eleni Nicolaidou, Director of the Development Cooperation Policy, Hellenic Aid and of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the introduction. I'm very honored to participate in this high-level meeting. Excellencies, distinguished participants, sustainable development is currently hampered by an international context of profound uncertainty and geopolitical divide. At halfway point, the SDGs are off track. SDGs will remain out of reach by 2030 or even by 2050 if there is no improvement in current trends. It is estimated that about 700 million people remain in extreme poverty, which is concentrated mainly in low-income countries and countries impacted by conflict and fragility. Climate change could push another 130 million into poverty unless climate action is accelerated. International development has become both more vital and more complex because the world of development has changed. The traditional donor-recipient model of the past is not working as it was. Additionally, fragile and conflict-affected states are a much bigger part of the problem. The destination remains unchanged. However, our approach needs to adapt to new realities. Developing countries need a different development approach based on mutual respect, powered by development finance scale, and a more responsive multilateral and international system. Improve action on trade, tax, debt, tackling dirty money and corruption, and delivering on global challenges like health, climate, and energy transition. The development progress required to meet the SDGs in 2030 requires much more than development assistance. It needs global policy change, a greater role for the private sector, for science and technology, and the whole of government approach for international development, partnerships with scientists, with academic institutions, with foundations, with civil society organizations, between businesses and governments. Partnerships which bring together innovation and creativity to address today's challenges, which money alone will never do. We support more open and inclusive approaches to international development. We need to work towards a more inclusive and more locally led approach. Aid must be focused on the lowest income countries and delivered as far as possible through local institutions and organizations. Countries from Global South have their own clear vision, strategy, and narrative about their development and progress. Country ownership is the key. This vision and assertiveness are more important factors for development success. Development cooperation could have a greater impact if it's to be increasingly designed and delivered by local people and organizations, especially marginalized groups, including women, girls, and local communities. Policy advice, technical knowledge, and funding will be more sustainable when we partner with those who best understand local needs and realities and determine their own development pathways. The financing gap to meet the SDGs and eliminate poverty is enormous. The OECD estimates that $3.9 trillion annually are required to achieve the SDGs by 2030. This requires, of course, rethinking and rewiring how governments, multilaterals, and the private sector support global development. In an increasingly complex financing landscape, official development assistance continues to play a crucial role as a catalytic element in the overall financing available to help achieving the 2030 agenda. ODA can help leverage other sources of financing, in particular public domestic financing, blended finance, and sustainable private investments, as well as other means of implementation or development enablers, such as supporting science and research, technology, innovation, and digitalization. Within the framework of the 4-year National Program for International Development Cooperation 2022-2025, Hellenic Aid develops partnerships to implement programs in sectoral priorities. For example, in the health sector, a priority area, Hellenic Aid is working closely with foundations and universities. I will present 2 such programs. The first one is the fetal medicine program. Greece attaches great importance to the health of women and children. According to statistics from the World Health Organization, more than 500,000 women die every year in the world as a result of complications related to pregnancy or delivery. Denying or limiting women's and girls' sexual and reproductive rights has devastating consequences for their lives and repercussions of their families and communities. In addition, women's control over their own bodies is central to achieving gender equality. Women's sexual and reproductive health is central to this program. The Hellenic Ministry of Foreign Affairs deploys medical research and diplomacy to deliver its development cooperation priorities and the preventable deaths of mothers, babies, and children. We adopt and promote policy and resources to defend strongly and advance sexual and reproductive health rights. In this context, the Hellenic Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the London-based foundation have partnered to implement a fetal medicine program for the period 2022-2025 in selected priority partner countries: Albania, Armenia, Ethiopia, Moldova, and Republic of North Macedonia, as well as in Kosovo. The aim is to contribute to the reduction of maternal and perinatal mortality through training in the use of ultrasound and the creation of fetal medicine units to improve the care of pregnant women. These units have been established in the main university hospitals in the capital cities of the above countries with the intention of providing free of charge care to women with high-risk pregnancies. Teams of doctors from the foundation have visited the above countries to give lectures and provide practical training on obstetric ultrasound. Delivering a world where every pregnancy is an informed choice, every childbirth is safe, and every young person can reach their potential will not only allow women and girls to exercise their fundamental rights, it will also help countries speed up their demographic transition and create the conditions for ending poverty. We cannot understand development unless we see it through the eyes of girls and women. Access to education, supporting family planning, and combating sexual violence is central to creating conditions for economic and social development. The fetal medicine program is inclusive by construction as it involves close collaboration and consultation with the beneficiaries. A second program is again in the area of health, is training of doctors. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs cooperates closely with the Medical School of University of Ioannina, Faculty of Medicine, to train doctors from Albania for many different specializations. These intensive training residencies range from 3 to 6 months. This program is jointly designed with the medical school and jointly implemented. Now, at the European level, the EU and its member states in 2022 have maintained their position as the biggest global official development assistance provider, accounting for 42% of global official development assistance, confirming their leadership in the global agenda on sustainable development. The best example of inclusiveness is the Global Gateway, delivered through a Team Europe approach, which brings together the EU and EU member states with their financial and development institutions, private sector organizations, and companies. The EU Global Gateway Strategy is an example to mobilize investments up to 300 billion between the period 2021-2027, aimed at also supporting partner countries to progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, thereby generating genuine and sustainable development outcomes that benefit local communities. The Global Gateway Strategy should be seen as an accelerator of the implementation of Agenda 2030 through international partnerships, bilaterally and at regional and multilateral level. The EU integrates the SDGs in the projects undertaken through Global Gateway, notably in relation to sustainable infrastructure for energy, transport, and digitalization, while together with EU member states as Team Europe has started to leverage additional funding, including private sector investments in support of the SDGs. The Global Gateway helps to tackle the most pressing global challenges, from fighting climate change to improving health systems and boosting competitiveness and security of global supply chains, taking into account the needs of partner countries and ensuring lasting benefits for local communities. This will allow EU partners to develop their societies and economies, but also create opportunities for EU member states, private sector to invest and remain competitive, while ensuring the highest environmental and labor standards, as well as sound financial management. In the framework of Global Gateway, local communities, business, and other stakeholders have their full say through meaningful civil society engagement at all stages of the investment cycle. Regions and local governments can play crucial roles, such as voicing the priorities of their local communities, especially for those often marginalized or underrepresented, fostering the local anchoring of projects, contributing to transparency and accountability, and facilitating the strategic assets needed to promote investment opportunities for sustainable development. Distinguished participants, the scale and complexity of the challenges we face require partnerships. We must proceed together with the private sector, civil society, scientific institutions, and anyone who is supporting the implementation of the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Nicolaidou. You made a powerful case for partnership within states and partnership among states and at the global level. It is interesting to think about the tasks of states to provide space for partnership, or to enable partnership, to promote partnership within countries, and to provide international conditions for partnerships at the international level. The experience of Global Gateway Strategy of the European Union is really very interesting and relatively new phenomenon, which hopefully will grow further and which will be producing experiences and also practical results that will benefit the world as a whole. So let us think about it and let us discuss this further. Now, the next speaker, the next panelist on my list is Mrs. Gloria Reyes, General Director of Superate Program of Presidency of the Dominican Republic. You have the floor, madam.
Muchas gracias, señor moderador.
Thank you very much, Moderator. President, Excellencies, Honourable authorities accompanying me on this panel, thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm very honoured to be part of this important forum where we are trying to pool and share with you some of the most recent experiences of the Dominican Republic as we try to achieve these sustainable development goals. I wish to begin with the following statement. Under the SDG framework, the policies that are defined with a view to social progress and inclusion should be multidimensional, and they should be interrelated in light of the complexity and interplay of the challenges that our countries are facing. These policies should be articulated on the basis of identifying each contributing sector in order to achieve a greater commitment and engagement in their implementation. It's important to highlight that the notion of sustainable development is the outcome of the interconnected work around the 4 dimensions or pillars that are mutually affecting one another, the social, environmental, economic, and institutional dimensions. For this reason, social policies should be considered as an investment rather than as an item of expenditure. So far as this relationship, this coordination allows each sector to understand its own relationship with its development. We should therefore achieve greater efficiency in their implementation. On the other hand, social and public policies for sustainable development must go beyond seeking immediate results. They actually require being institutionalized in order to become sustainable over time. This, in turn, makes it possible to see the impact in the life cycle around which these policies have been created, and thus leave no one behind. I want to share with you now just a few ideas on this path of leaving no one behind. The first thing is that we must clearly establish who we are prioritizing. For this, we must have information. It is crucial to be able to identify those who are trailing furthest behind and therefore most vulnerable to climate, social, and economic shocks. We must have robust social information systems such as universal social household registers that combine different methodologies and that are fed into using different sources to give us the visibility that we need. In the case of the Dominican Republic, we have the unique beneficiaries system, which is helping us move towards a universal register. Secondly, identifying the patterns of discrimination in the policies and social practices that we have to deal with. Analyzing who should be the priority helps us to identify the root causes and also the instruments that should be prioritized. Now, for instance, we know that the selection patterns for prioritizing populations that are not evidence-based leads to greater bias in inclusion or even exclusion in social programs. Thirdly, we must identify what we need to do. As I was mentioning just a moment ago, the actions should complement the economic, social, environmental, institutional spheres in order to achieve progress and results in a sustainable way. Fourth, monitoring and evaluating the outcomes in order to reassess and correct continuously. And last but not least, accountability and the meaningful participation of a diverse range of stakeholders participating in policies. In the case of the Dominican Republic, we have a range of instruments such as the National Development Strategy that highlights the importance of bringing decisions back to the grassroots level and achieving greater identification of needs and more efficient, effective participation. Giving priority to social policies means going beyond fragmentation and making way for integrated social protection systems that can articulate and combine contributory and non-contributory sectors. We must formulate policies in an interrelated and joined-up way in taking into account different areas of action with alliances between civil society, government, and the private sector. This cooperation helps us to mobilize resources and, above all, fulfill the commitments so that the invested resources have the impact that we want and the results can be maintained and are sustainable in the medium term. One example in the Dominican Republic is the education sector, where we have assigned 4% of the GDP for pre-university educational spending. We advocate for our governments continuing to recognize that what is needed is prioritize public policies in the social sphere is actually reflected and finds concrete form in the structure of our country's budget. We should move towards defining social policies that are universal in nature and set the minimum level of social protection so that we can guarantee the rights of the entire population. Again, in the case of the Dominican Republic, we can highlight some examples along this path we have started along. For instance, we have guaranteed health by providing a minimum level of public health services. We are now able to provide health insurance for the entire population that did not have it, and 98% has healthcare insurance, and roughly half of this population comes under state coverage. We also have a pilot program for the community of carers. This is a national network of carers, male and female, who are certified, and this improves the offer of services in care and expands school enrollment for boys and girls from 3 to 5 years. We have also expanded the Solidarity Pensions Payment Program for the population that is aged over 65 and does not receive income, for households with persons with disabilities, or led by women with children under 5 years of age who are in conditions of extreme poverty. Also, we are working on a minimum basic income program, which we will launch gradually. This allows us to grant a monetary transfer to households in extreme poverty. Through this, we hope to eliminate extreme poverty in our country and also generate a positive impact in reducing hunger and food insecurity at a national level. Lastly, none of these policies can be sustainable if there are not mechanisms that ensure social protection for households in the context of external shocks of different types. In the case of the Dominican Republic, once again, we have a contingency support fund, which is a sort of distress payment that can be paid for up to 6 months to households that have been affected and that are identified through a basic emergency record, the FIBE in Spanish. This aims to improve the resiliency of households against external shocks that they face, and they do face them with increasing frequency, especially as regards shocks due to climate change. These programs are being implemented thanks to increases in the financial resources that have been reassigned from the national budget, giving priority to social policies. Finally, I would like to highlight that these public policies can help us to achieve inclusive, resilient, and equitable societies that leave no one behind if they are coordinated and they come in conjunction with a strong commitment, strong leadership from government. There has to be a strong political will for these, and above all, we require alliances with the different sectors that make up our nations. I thank you.
I thank Madam Gloria Reyes for her statement and for her very interesting and also penetrating explanations on the importance of national social policy making. I'd like to us all think about the emphasis she made on the importance, the essential importance of social policy and social aspect for the entirety of sustainable development. Sustainable development has been, and still often is, understood as basically something that relates to environment, as if environmental sustainability would somehow automatically take care of the rest of sustainability. I know that I'm simplifying a little, perhaps caricaturing a little bit some of the discussions that have been dominant in the past. But more and more it is clear that without social sustainability, there is no sustainability of development. And of course, sustainable social policies require a universal approach, an approach which demonstrates that without appropriate social policies, development in a country is not likely to work. And we are grateful for the emphasis you made on these aspects. Now I give the floor to the last among the, but not least, of the members of the panel, Professor Sabine Alkire, who is a professor of poverty and human development and director of the Oxford University Poverty and Human Development Initiative. You have the floor, madam.
Moderator, to Madam Chair and the organisers for the opportunity to interchange, and I look forward to hearing your reflections. The theme of this event being to foster social development and justice through social policies is for two reasons: to accelerate progress and to achieve the overarching goal of poverty eradication. And our keynote speaker, Nora Lustig, focused on monetary poverty. And I will focus on multidimensional poverty, which complements monetary by looking at interlocked deprivations directly, and talk about how the level of multidimensional poverty has changed globally, how social policy can accelerate such change, and the poverty measure can make that change visible, and data needs. So focusing on the first, a multidimensional poverty index illuminates the deprivations that are experienced by people who are left behind in multiple indicators at the same time, many of these related to different SDGs. And this is the case in developing countries, which I will focus on, but also, according to Angus Deaton, Nobel laureate in economics, in high-income countries as well. And we start from the lived experience of the protagonists of poverty, the men, women, and children who are the experts because of their lived conditions. In looking at trends in multidimensional poverty, we use two measures, one that can be compared and one that is context-specific. The global MPI is internationally comparable across 10 indicators and over 100 countries, whereas national MPIs use dimensions and indicators specific to their context, and these are official permanent statistics used for policy purposes and reported as SDG Indicator 1.2.2. So to start with national MPIs in the global SDG database, we can look at countries in different regions like Paraguay, where multidimensional poverty fell from 41 to 25% in 8 years, or Vietnam from 18 to 4%, or Bhutan from 12.4 to 2.1%. We can look at subnational trends. In Paraguay, the rural areas were poorest and reduced poverty the fastest. Or we can look at the indicators that poor people experience together. In Bhutan, all 13 reduced significantly. And when we step out from a few country examples to look across the 78 countries in the database, 2.5 billion people live in countries with a national multidimensional poverty index, and 550 in a country reporting the at-risk of poverty or social exclusion. And we have trends for 62 countries, not since 1995, but since 2010. And these trends vary greatly in terms of the reduction of these non-monetary deprivations and also the number of poor. But by different ways of projecting and estimating, 1/3 to 1/2 are likely to be on track to cut the incidence of poverty by 1/2 between 2015 and 2030. But that means there is room and need to accelerate progress. Moving to an internationally comparable measure, which is the global MPI, jointly computed with UNDP and covering 10 indicators across health, education, and living standards. It includes things like if anybody in your household or family is undernourished, if nobody has 6 years of schooling, if you lack clean cooking fuel, adequate sanitation, safe water, electricity, or good quality houses. And a person is poor not if they have one deprivation, but if they're deprived in 1/3 of the weighted indicators. And across 6.1 billion people, 92% of the population of the developing world, 1.1 billion people live in this acute definition of poverty, half of them being children, 2/3 being in middle-income countries, and 83% living in South Asia or sub-Saharan Africa. But this has fallen, and that's what I wanted to point out, because this is going to measure direct impacts, outcomes of social policies. To take the example of Cambodia, in 7.5 years that straddled the COVID pandemic, the incidence fell from 36.7 to 16.6%. Children were the poorest and reduced poverty the fastest. Deprivations in 9 of the 10 indicators went down, but in school attendance they went up. But interestingly, they were much lower increases among the poor than the non-poor, perhaps making visible social protection policies. But the signal case, Madam Chair, is the case of India, in which 415 million people exited multidimensional poverty from 2005-6 to 2019-21, where incidence fell from 55.1 to 16.4%. And interestingly, in that case, from a leave no one behind perspective, the poorest groups, children, rural areas, the poorest state like Bihar, Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, they had the fastest reduction of multidimensional poverty. Across 81 countries where we have trend, it's about 5.4 billion people. 25 countries cut their multidimensional poverty by 1/2 within 15 years. And these are countries from all regions of the world with low poverty, like Dominican Republic, or higher levels of poverty. And so these show that the SDG target 1.2 is possible. And they make visible direct impacts of social policy that perhaps would take longer to be visible in monetary poverty. If we look across the 81 countries, we do not present interpolations, extrapolations, or predictions. But there is a large net reduction at the global level. So globally, across the countries and time periods that we have, the world would be on track. But these are driven by certain fast-moving contexts, and they're very varied across the regions of the world. Reductions in South Asia of all countries for which we have data drive the trends. And the next fastest progress is in sub-Saharan Africa. But we lack post-COVID data in nearly all countries, and regular updates are also often missing. So both national context-specific poverty measures and the global one show a need to be able to accelerate progress. And here I want to build on what my co-panelists have articulated, the many good policies, the consideration of many actors, civil society, private sector, and the need for finance, to also look at poverty metrics as tools of motivation, performance monitoring, and management. I'll begin with observations of the late Sir Tony Atkinson in his last book, where he observed that one function of poverty statistics is to motivate people to tackle a key challenge. And he recognized statistics to be a performance indicator, and that this role has become more prominent in the SDG era. And that is something, in a sense, that can be positive when it makes visible good changes that occur on the ground in a collected way. For example, when Nigeria launched its updated MPI, disaggregated to the senatorial district, they observed you cannot manage what you cannot measure. Their MPI complements, it does not replace their monetary poverty measure. It makes visible and shines a light on the lived experience of poverty across Nigeria. But it also gives information that can be used at different levels of government, states being very important, and lower levels, to manage change. Another book that came out last year by the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and former president of Colombia, published by Oxford University Press, looked at the reduction by 1/3 of Colombia's multidimensional poverty and monetary poverty over 8 years, and observed that the fight against poverty in that context occurred during peace negotiations, and that leadership took a very direct interest in the social policy. The book also describes how the social policy challenges were identified very clearly, and that without addressing these, it would be difficult to win the peace. And so there was a need to use metrics and evidence as public policy tools so that the priority of the fight against poverty would not remain on paper, but become a positive reality. And they used 2 mechanisms, a roundtable involving all ministers, so that they knew that poverty was a team sport. They needed to play together, to play to win, and their wins would be celebrated. And a dashboard integrated with the key performance indicators with a results-based framework and targets. So in terms of accelerating reductions, remembering that multidimensionally poor people are those who are deprived in many indicators at the same time. If those deprivations go down, there is a leaving no one behind effect already, and it can make visible at very local levels how the face of poverty changes and what needs to be done. This is an image of the senatorial districts of Nigeria, and the indicator patterns vary greatly, but it provides some information. Across the 64 countries in our South-South network, we are learning of the many different policy uses that different governments are taking, depending on the shape and the priorities of their time. But complementing monetary poverty statistics, allocating resources, targeting households as with registry data, or marginalized groups like ethnic groups. Coordinating, which is very, very important for the integrated policies many co-panelists have discussed. And communicating so that academics, students, civil society actors can engage. So that is a little bit on the framework. And the last observation is that all of this requires data. But after the pandemic, and in the face of the data revolution, there's an observation that in some contexts, poverty data is being left behind. And so with UNDP, there has been an urgent call that there be an investment in the poverty data that could make visible the fruits of change and in turn motivate different actors, different partnerships to invest, as Gloria Reyes said, to invest in social policies for the sake of the poor, who are our ethical population of interest, and also to move the needle on poverty. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Professor Akira, and this was a wonderful concluding part of our presentations in this panel, because it gave us a very comprehensive view of a fundamental problem, the problem of poverty, both multidimensional poverty and monetary poverty, and it showed the power of data and serious analysis of data, which can not only help us to manage, in other words, design policies, execute policies, but also motivate, which can motivate action for the future. That's extremely important. I myself, I was involved in the discussions in the United Nations since late 1980s through the UNDP Human Development Report and all these further discussions, and we have seen how slowly the capacity for analyzing the profiles of poverty and understanding poverty through data analysis has grown. Today, the world is in a much better situation in that regard than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. When the Copenhagen Summit or Social Development put eradication of poverty as the commitment number 2, very high on the list of commitments, there was very little in terms of the sophistication of analysis which we've now heard about. So this is a wonderful tool, not only for management, not only for policy making and policy evaluation, but also for motivation. And I think that that's something very important to take with us from this panel. And of course, we are not concluding our discussion. We are actually only beginning. And I would like to start with an encouraging fact that we are strictly within time frame. I was offered by the Secretariat a plan, and we should be finishing the panel at 4:20. It's now 4:21 or 4:22. We are doing very well, and I'm very happy to have such a powerful and yet at the same time disciplined group of panel members, irrespective of the fact that the gender balance here is not perfect, but that's a separate question altogether. Anyway, what I'm saying is now is the time for you, distinguished participants, to ask questions to the panelists and also to the keynote speaker, Professor Noura Lustig, who spoke very powerfully earlier on in our discussion, and all the panelists. We have about 1 hour for questions, answers, and comments. But we have to be also disciplined, and the rule, which I'm told is now sacrosanct in the United Nations, is that speakers should speak within 3-minute time limit. And of course, your cooperation will be highly appreciated. So now the floor is open. The floor is open for questions, and I see that the first delegation on my list is the delegation of Turkey. I give them the floor. I don't.
Thank you. Dear participants, the Agenda for Sustainable Development provides a global roadmap to protect our planet today and for future generations, enable the people to live in dignity. Turkey stands as one of the few nations that have not only embraced this agenda within its borders, but extend it beyond. In the words of President His Excellency Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the main axis of Turkish policy based on humanitarian values. Hence, in Syria, Palestine, Ukraine, and Myanmar, no matter where, if human life is at stake, there is an oppressed person. Turkey lends its support and raises voice in the global arena. The situation in Gaza demands immediate action to alleviate the ongoing humanitarian crisis. Turkey, as always, stands ready to do its utmost. We remain dedicated to tirelessly working until we distribute social welfare fairly to all segments of society. We are providing services to ensure that all our citizens are under the umbrella of social protection. We carry out more than 50 social assistance programs, paying particularly attention to the fact that these programs are thematic and thus respond to all the needs of every individual in society. We also design our social assistance programs to respond to temporary deprivation by preventing citizens from entering the cycle of poverty. By our provision of temporary unemployment assistance, we encourage social assistance beneficiaries and unemployment citizens to participate in the labor force. In this way, we prevent economic dependency on social assistance. We work to provide the sustainability of both society and personal welfare. Working towards the vision of inclusive, resilient, and equitable societies represent the finest investment in our shared future and the most meaningful legacy we can leave for our children. As I conclude,
I'm sorry to
remarks,
interrupt the speaker. Your 3 minutes has elapsed. Please conclude your statement.
As I conclude my remarks, I would like to express my gratitude to all participants. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of the European Union.
Thank you very much. The European Union and its member states strongly support the Global Coalition for Social Justice and its ambition. The coalition has been mentioned by a number of speakers of the panel. The Social Justice for All Summit highlighted the need to prioritize social justice at the core of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And despite the unprecedented worldwide expansion of mainly short-term social protection interventions during the pandemic, as President Turk mentioned in the panel, still more than 4 billion people around the world remain entirely unprotected. The European Union has reinforced support to partner countries in building comprehensive, sustainable, and shock-responsive social protection systems with a view to promoting universal access to social protection. And having this in mind, I would like to ask a question to the panelists on how do you see the move from social term and fragmented social transfers to nationally owned, universal, comprehensive, and shock-responsive social protection systems, which are instrumental for sustainable poverty reduction and social justice. Thank you.
Thank you. The panelists have taken note of the question and will have an opportunity to answer questions after we hear the speakers at the current stage of our discussion. I give the floor to the representative of the Philippines.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, good afternoon. I address you today with an expanded perspective on our strategies, emphasizing the imperative of breaking the cycle of poverty through prioritizing developmental programs, recognizing the critical importance of a whole-of-nation approach. Our interventions are designed to foster sustainable social progress and inclusivity through the synergy of government agencies, private sectors, NGOs, and local communities. Recently, we signed the Philippines UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework 2024 to 2028, which charts the areas of cooperation between the Philippines and the United Nations. One of the main outcome priorities of the UNSDCF on human capital development, inclusion, and resilience building envisions that by 2028, all Filipinos, all people, especially those at risk of being left behind, have increased resilience to economic, climatic, disaster, and public health risk through improved equitable and gender-responsive access to and utilization of quality social services, social protection, healthy habitat, enhanced good governance, and peace. Our commitment to holistic social policies extends beyond rhetoric to tangible actions, prioritizing developmental programs that delve into the root causes of poverty. Education, skills training, and healthcare initiatives are not mere components, but the foundational pillars of our strategy. Our aim is to empower individuals with the necessary tools to break free from the entanglements of the cycle of poverty. In the Philippines, our pursuit of breaking the poverty cycle is manifested in our commitment to community-driven development initiatives such as the Kapit Bisig Laban sa Kahirapan comprehensive and integrated delivery of social services exemplify our approach. This program goes beyond conventional methodologies by directly involving local communities in the identification, planning, and implementation of development projects. Through Kalahi Seeds, solutions are not imposed, but are meticulously tailored to meet the specific needs and aspirations of each community. Moreover, legislative initiatives such as enacting the Philippines Conditional Cash Transfer Act underscores the government's unwavering commitment to ensuring the sustainability of social programs. In conclusion, let it be a resounding call to action for our global community. Together, let us champion the cause of breaking the cycle of poverty through holistic, community-driven approaches and legislative initiatives. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Philippines and give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Moderator, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Developing and implementing inclusive family-centered policies and programs that consider the needs and expectations of families ensures achievement of inclusive, resilient, and equitable societies that leave no one behind. Some of the strategies that Kenya has implemented includes establishing robust social protection programs that provide a safety net for vulnerable populations, ensuring that they have access to essential services. They include, 1, the Financial Inclusion Fund, popularly referred to as Hustler Fund, which provides access to credit with low interest rates for personal, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in Kenya. The fund is accessed through mobile money transfer. Since it was launched on November 2022, the fund has disbursed 39.7 billion Kenya shillings, which is an equivalent of USD 250 million, to 21.8 million people, and mobilized 2 billion Kenya shillings in savings, with the total repayments at 28.75 billion Kenya shillings. 2, strengthening community health initiatives, access and utilization of health services are key to the improvement of health outcomes in health care. Kenya is investing in community health workers and community-based programs which will improve health awareness, preventive care, and access to basic services in rural areas. 3, on digital transformation, Kenya has heavily invested in enhancing access and delivery of ICT infrastructure and electricity through programs such as the 100,000 kilometers last mile fiber optic cable and the last mile connectivity program, which is used in facilitating job creation, digital literacy, and access to the digital economy. Question: what mechanisms should be put in place to ensure inclusion of persons with disabilities in digital transformation? What lessons and best practices can we learn from other countries? Thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya and give the floor to the representative of Costa Rica.
Thank you very much, Moderator. I'll be very brief. It has been made very clear during this afternoon's panel that it is extremely important that data collection be carried out. But data collection for states has always represented a major challenge. There have been difficulties in collection because of the different methodologies that are used. We have different criteria across Latin America, for instance, so very often the same multi-factorial analysis can be read in different ways depending on this methodology. And so my question for the panelists and for our expert is basically which national experiences and which criteria should be adopted or could be adopted in order to ensure the correct reading of these different methods for gathering data, and which ones can really allow us to focus on and address the multiple causes of poverty, and how do we translate this into action in public policies that can truly operationalize such efforts and allow states to truly combat poverty and extreme poverty in the terms of the priorities that the representative of the Dominican Republic mentioned. Thank you.
I thank the delegate of Costa Rica for his statement and question, and give the floor to the representative of the non-governmental organization, Parents House Foundation.
Dear distinguished delegates, thank you for the voice of the NGOs. I am Judith Regős from Hungary, the president of Parents House Foundation. The eradication of poverty is a global issue that is interlinked with all social, economic, environmental, health, and justice issues. Parents House Foundation collaborates with organizations in countries with diverse socio-economic backgrounds that prioritize poverty eradication and the reduction of the risk of poverty through support for families and children. We believe that global processes interact with local conditions. Therefore, it is essential to support local groups that want to make a difference. Facilitating peer support for vulnerable groups is crucial to eradicating poverty. The most vulnerable group in society cannot be accepted to initiate change without external support. However, those who have the socio-cultural and economic advantage to do so can be accepted to develop methods and tools with these groups that can bring about sustainable development in the long term. Parents House Foundation and its partner organization work with such methodologies. Our aim is to turn families into a cohesive and a functional unit that can actively shape society. In the Do Good Things community, we assist children and young people in care, as well as their carers who are most at risk of poverty. We use a global approach to tackle the problem, which is adapted to local opportunities and considers local needs. It is crucial for everyone to find innovative ways to strengthen resilient communities within their means. This will help avoid the risk of poverty and ultimately eradicate it. Taking action is essential to create a sustainable world in long term where everyone can live in security and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Distinguished participants, this was the last speaker from the current list of speakers, and I would like now to invite the panel members and our keynote speaker, Professor Nora Lustig, who I understand is online and is in contact with us, to comment on what they have heard in the discussion. Their comments would be welcome to address anything that other panelists have said and what the participants in the discussion have said. I will try to make sure that they also answer the three questions that were asked. Of course, we'll hear first the panelists, and if they do not provide all the answers, I'll remind them of the answers that are still needed given the questions that we have received. So I suggest that we move in this stage of our work this afternoon with the same sequence of speakers. And I would like first to ask if our keynote speaker, Professor Nora Lustig, wishes to say something at this point. If not, she can come in later. And I understand that she has still a decent quota of time available for her second comment after she had already provided us with the very persuasive keynote speech. Is Professor Lustig online?
Yes, here I am, Mr. Moderator. Do you want me to respond? Well, first of all, let me say that I don't have an answer for what's the best practice to incorporate people with disabilities in the digital economy, but I think it's a very important question, and I hope that if not today, the answer can be provided. And I often think, especially given my age, that one of the group that is really excluded from the digital era tends to be the elderly, the senior citizens. And I think that an effort has to be made if we think of an inclusive world to make sure that it doesn't become an alienating experience, as I see often around me. This is more on sort of personal rather than scholarly mention. I just wanted to refer to two things that were raised, one by the European Union, and I think the other question was by the Costa Rican delegate. The question that was raised by the delegate from the European Union is very broad because it's how do we transform fragmented systems into comprehensive and integrated systems, but it's very important for countries to work on that. Otherwise, one can introduce lots of inconsistencies among programs. So I guess, the first thing that every country has to do is have an inventory of what programs exist, what are they supposed to address, how are they financed, how are they monitored and evaluated, and then think about how they can be integrated into something that's more sort of meaningful with respect to the goals. I remember that many years ago, during President Lula's first term, there was an assessment of all the different programs that existed in Brazil. They were subsumed eventually under Bolsa Familia, which has become a tremendously successful program. And it is an experience perhaps to look into to see how you can move gradually towards systems that are more coherent. and able to address poverty in its multiple dimensions. And a very important element, and I was very glad to hear this repeatedly during the presentations today, is that what do we have in the countries to address shocks? Maybe, we have social insurance, social protection, safety nets at the individual level available. But what happens when we face systemic shocks? Like one very big one we had recently with the pandemic, and what to do when there are economic crisis or natural disasters or conflict. I think it's very important to think about how to make existing interventions versatile so that they can be expanded and contracted depending on the needs by the economy or by the country, depending on what type of shock it is faced. Rather than improvise, it's important to have institutions that are, or rather programs that are regulating in the face of shocks, and also for countries to be able to fund the additional resources that may be needed in a way that is coherent. So those are a few ideas, but there's lots to discuss about this very important question. I think that the other important question was about how do we set conventions so that our indicators are comparable, both for multidimensional poverty, for income poverty, and also for example, fiscal redistribution, which is the indicator that I mentioned today. I think that on the multidimensional poverty, Sabina will probably be able to address this question and share what is the convention that has been applied in many countries so that results are comparable. For the income poverty, I think that there is also right now a convention. The World Bank is a custodian for the poverty indicator for the SDG monitoring, but it has sharpened the methodology. In particularly, it has introduced the idea of different poverty lines depending on the level of development, which is very important for countries that are not the poorest of the world to use adequate poverty lines. And finally, for the case of fiscal redistribution, I think that what we have tried in my institute is precisely to develop a method that would allow to get comparable results, both across countries and over time. And I think that the best you can do in order to ensure comparability is to rely on solid methodological approaches, be conscious of their shortcomings, and accept conventions so that results are comparable across countries and over time. And let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for these additional thoughts, which obviously would lead to further discussion. And now I would like to ask the panelists in the order, as I said before, in the order in which they first spoke, to give their comments on the views expressed by other panelists, to the comments made from the participants, and to the questions. Now I give the floor to Madame Valérie Berset-Bircher.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I'll try to respond to one of the questions about the measures established to better include persons with disabilities. As I'd said earlier, we are carrying out various impact assessments for our regulations, and we also are striving to foster multi-party consultation mechanisms with civil society, especially those representing people in vulnerable situations. And we have a federal law on eliminating inequality that concerns persons with disabilities, and we are really trying to strengthen these laws, amending where necessary, This decision was made 1 year ago, so we are currently amending legislation. And we have 2 major projects. First of all, better integration for persons with disabilities on the job market, which is extremely important. And this is also related to improving integration in the digital world and digital access, because that is a key part of the job market. And we also are working to universalize access to all public services. And this also needs to be improved in our country. And we're doing this through legislation with those 2 major focuses. Thank you.
Thank you. And now give the floor to Madam Eleni Nicolaidou.
Yes, thank you. I will try to answer one of the questions on for people with disabilities. Now, we have a number of ministries trying to do some work in order to facilitate these people. For example, we have the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Digitalization, and the Ministry of Social Services, who are providing various programs. But I think the most important one is a program which is done in cooperation with an NGO, which is online access, especially that was during the time of the pandemic, online access to education and all social services. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask now Madam Gloria Reyes for her opinion, her views, and answers to the questions.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, moderator. I am going to address the question from the delegate of Costa Rica as regards the national experience that we have in the data collection processes for decision-making. In the case of the Dominican Republic, we have some experience, such as in the use of technologies and administrative data for improving data collection, and in order to reduce costs when we are gathering data. This is the major obstacle that states have, the cost associated with gathering the data and calculating the cost of these universal payments. Very recently, we have used and implemented AI, artificial intelligence, to gather this data, and self-registration. We have had campaigns also to raise awareness amongst the population so that they can carry out these self-assessments or self-declarations. We're also using data to identify vulnerable populations and focus on where we need to gather the data for national action. These are some examples that we have used in light of the different alternatives available to use data. Interoperability continues to be a problem. This is not possible very often because of the way in which the data is collected and the different methodologies that are used. And this is an issue often within governments, harmonizing the way that data is gathered. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Professor Sabine Elkayer for her comments and also for answering the remaining questions.
Thank you so much. I learned a great deal. And in terms of the Philippines, I really salute the leadership of community-driven development of the CBMS, community-based monitoring system, many innovative practices that we have learned from that context. And I wanted to say 3 things. One is you mentioned gender, you mentioned climate, and in terms of multidimensional poverty measures, they can be disaggregated or analyzed by gender. For example, of the 1.2 billion people, 1.1 billion people who were multidimensionally poor, 2/3 of them did not have an educated woman, any girl or woman who had completed 6 years of schooling in their household. So you can do that for any individual indicators of employment or nutrition or education. And similarly for climate, you can geospatially merge the household survey data with data on disasters like cyclones, earthquakes, forest loss, wildfire, air precipitate quality, to try to look at the overlaps between environmental threats that affect the same people at the same time as the multiple dimensions of poverty. And so that perhaps responds a little bit. In terms of the sister from Kenya, I would just say one other thing about disability, which is that many of the forthcoming technologies, for example, on the telephone for people who are visually impaired or who have different challenges, are only available in English. And so a low-hanging fruit is to translate these technologies into languages of other communities. And from Costa Rica, I will answer now in English, but in terms of translation to political policies, after 10 years of having a measure, a number of countries revise the indicators to make them apt for the present moment. And so it can be a time of adjusting the measures or the indicators within an MPI, which Costa Rica has, for example, to better reflect the current priorities, to make sure they're policy relevant, to make sure, of course, they abide by technical criteria, and that they reflect the outcomes that the protagonists most value. And so going through the exercise to align the poverty metric with the National Development Plan and priorities means that it walks in lockstep. And so in realizing a plan or in realizing some priorities, one is simultaneously addressing indicators in a multidimensional metric. So Colombia, Bhutan has just finished. Colombia, Mexico, these countries are in process of revisiting their structure and their indicators. And Costa Rica already has been field building and merging administrative data during the pandemic to look at children and education during that difficult time period. The last, very quickly, that I would say is to recognize the first speaker from Turkey and raised a very important point, namely that conflict has an impoverishing effect. And you focus on or mentioned that a priority in Turkey is to prevent poverty. But I think it's also, for a person that works on poverty reduction, seeing poverty being created is quite a sobering fact, especially in light of the fiscal constraints we've heard from many of the speakers. And so how that comes in to our discussion, I don't know, but it seems an important observation and one worth recognizing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we heard the comments by the panelists and the keynote speaker, and I believe that they answered all the questions that were put, to the extent those questions can be answered at this point. Now, we still have time, and I would like to ask the participants if there are further questions or further comments that would be made from the floor. There is an opportunity for all of you to take advantage of the presence of a very qualified panel, and if there are any questions or comments, of course, this is the time to make them. Well, if not, then I think we may perhaps proceed to concluding our panel. Would that be acceptable, Madam President? I would, if you allow me to say a few words as moderator before concluding, and of course then handing over the baton to you to continue your exercising your powers as President of the Commission. What I would like to say by way of conclusion are really a few things, first related to what we heard in the panel, and how what we heard in the panel relates to the reality that is being reported. It's being reported in the media, in various United Nations reports, in various ways in which we follow the developments around the world. We live at a time when it is easy to be pessimistic because peace and security are threatened. We have heard from the delegate of Turkey about some of the problems that are currently characterizing the global situation, and they have an impact on everything. Just think about the effects of current military conflicts on the rise of military spending and the effect that that might have on social policy making. So it's easy to come to pessimistic conclusions about the difficult time in which we live and about how the problems of poverty reduction, poverty elimination, which are already formidable, are exacerbated by challenges to international peace and security. But then on the other hand, what we heard in the panel today gives us many reasons for hope. And I don't wish to go through an entire list of concepts and elements of experience or conclusions from experience that could give us and should give us reasons for hope. We heard, for example, an interesting concept of virtuous circle, that actually policy making, social policy making requires partnerships which have to cooperate in a virtuous sense. Now this brings us to something very fundamental, the ethics of social policy making. Ethics of social policy making, ethics which is very often neglected in discussions like the ones that we hear in the United Nations and other political fora. It is deeply ethical to strive for social policies that aim to provide real improvement for the people. And that can be done only through a set of partnerships which include governments, of course, and governments have to provide space and have to provide assistance to such processes. And therefore, this is the way in which social policies can become comprehensive, can become universal in a certain way. And that, of course, is a very important concept which I think we shall take from this panel. Social justice as the basis of multilateralism. I think we should think about this idea much more than we are used to. Multilateralism is not only about power politics and power bases which allows institutional forms of multilateralism to be established. It requires real content, and real content is social justice. We heard a great deal about the experience in measuring fiscal policies and how they affect improvement of people, reduction of poverty, and other objectives. And we can be encouraged by what we heard. Again, Professor Lustig has given us a very interesting and very deep insight into the problem and into the fact that there are positive effects that we have to be much more attentive to. And then obviously is the whole area of data. What we cannot measure, we cannot manage. That's a fundamental rule which obviously was very much there at the time when the Sustainable Development Goals were developed and when Sustainable Development Goals implementation was discussed. It was obvious that, for example, the United Nations Statistical Commission, Statistical Division of the UN Secretariat should play a critical role in defining the measures, defining indicators, defining techniques. And we have heard at this panel how this helps explaining not only explaining the multidimensional and monetary and other forms of poverty, but it also explains how certain effects and positive changes were achieved, and those positive changes are by no means negligible. They are very considerable, and therefore measuring progress is not only a technical exercise. Measuring progress is also a source of political inspiration, a source of inspiration for social policy makers. Another important lesson that we take from this panel. So these are the kind of things, and I, of course, as I said before, I have no ambition to go into all aspects of this very rich discussion which has showed us so much. But I would like to relate this to something that the UN has to be thinking about a lot in the coming month and year, this year and next year. And that is, the UN is now preparing a summit for the future and a World Social Summit in 2025. And World Social Summit in 2025 should be, to a very large extent, about what our panel is discussing today. Not only to those aspects, but those aspects are very much at the center. And let us start thinking about how we, meaning people who, actually make up the United Nations, because United Nations is not an empty institution. United Nations is about people who work in the United Nations as delegates, as experts, as secretariat, and in every other way. How should we who care about social development and who see the opportunities of these important conferences of the United Nations, how do we envisage actual preparations? Again, I'm not going to go into the institutional side, into political side and policy side and diplomatic processes which are necessary, just perhaps a few general ideas which are inspired by what we heard at the panel today. I think it would be important that the UN approaches questions of social policy making and social development more generally in a comprehensive way. And what does that mean? I believe that resident coordinators who work in most of the United Nations member states should be tasked to start working systematically on profiles of social policy making in the countries in which they work. And it would be very interesting how that work, how that effort could help the World Social Summit in 2025, for example. Of course, a methodology has to be prepared, a methodology which would not be too difficult to prepare given the United Nations experience, but actually full use of resident coordinators of the United Nations. Secondly, the question of regional commissions. Regional commissions have very good overviews of specific issues of policy, of social development in different regions of the world. And regional commissions should be now empowered to do a very important job, to bring to the conference, to the summit, a very comprehensive profile of social policy making in their respective regions. Another important task which I think we should start thinking about. It's not yet the time for decisions, but thinking has to take place. And then it would be interesting to operationally articulate the social mandates of the UN system and the UN system members as a whole, UN programs, funds, and agencies. Obviously, agencies such as International Labour Organization, UNESCO, WHO, and others will be critical. But the interesting thing is whether this is a moment in history of the United Nations where it would be possible to develop something like a, let's use some ambitious language here, a UN social mandate. A UN social mandate. Of course, every agency, every program, every fund is doing important things. There is no doubt about that. Every agency, every fund, every program has its own set of constituencies. This is the reality, and we accept that reality. But there also should be ambition. And the panel today showed us that progress is possible and indeed is taking place even in these difficult circumstances. And therefore, ambitious ideas about what should one expect from the United Nations are appropriate. And therefore, if we want to do something really important and useful, think about whether UN is capable of articulating a comprehensive UN social mandate. We have elements for that, we have ingredients for that, we have constituencies for that, and the UN also has many friends around the world who can be very helpful in that regard. So the level of ambition can be quite high. And I would like to use this unique opportunity as moderator of this panel to simply push for such a stronger, more ambitious approach. Now I see that the delegate of Egypt ask for the floor, I give her the floor clearly, and then I will say a few more sentences to conclude our meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and I would like to thank the panelists for the interventions that they have given and the insightful input that they have put forward, and which touched upon a number of issues that are truly cross-cutting when it relates to how we can achieve social justice from various perspectives. But and this is the general discussion. These are the topics that we generally handle, but your latest comment actually triggered some sort of a response from my delegation, because it is very pertinent to what we are discussing now. Tomorrow we're starting the negotiations on the Pact for the Future, for example. This is a crucial issue, and it is going to be a long process, I believe, because the document is quite long and it has various elements, different chapters, so we need to be cautious on how we approach this, but also when it relates to how the UN is going to provide its input for the social summit. And let me just say that the negotiations even on that are not over yet. So the social summit, the reference that came in the OCA report has been a bit vague in a sense, and delegations who are very much attached to CSocD, who are very much attached to the social development agenda, have been really pushing forward that it should have a social development approach, putting people at the center of development, addressing all the core issues that come in Copenhagen, which are unfortunately are still unfulfilled. So it means that we haven't been really working in the collective sense as well as in the national sense. We haven't been really living up to our commitments that were made more than 30 years ago, or almost 30 years ago, on what relates to social development in a sense. But the contribution of the UN, the way you phrased it, it seems that you have maybe a more elaborate idea of how the UN, through the resident coordinator system, through the regional commissions, and also this idea of the social mandate, because it is quite ambitious and forward-looking. But again, such an idea needs to be thought through, because as you mentioned, agencies, UN agencies, have their own governing bodies, they have their own mandates. I know that, for example, the ILO has developed some work when it relates to some of the aspects of social development, but I don't believe that the ILO as a standalone entity, UN agency, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, specialized agency within the system, to address this from its own perspective only, taking into consideration that it has its own constituency, which is quite distinct from other UN specialized agencies, but also the approach that it takes is quite different from the holistic view of what we mean by social development. So we need to take a breath and to think what we mean by social development, not only from the labor perspective, not only from the economic perspective, but also from a holistic approach that takes also not only the levels of development within nations and countries, but also how the society in itself develops, its own value system, how it formulates its own social structure, the relations between different strata of the society, not only from the economic aspect, but also from the social aspect. So it is an interesting idea, but we need to tread carefully, I believe, when we put forward those ideas, and maybe you have more to give us on this. Thank you.
Thank you. I was a UN diplomat for many years, and I know the importance of being careful. I'm not a diplomat now, and I can be more easily inspired by very, I think, rich discussion that we have heard from our panel members. And I think the advantage of such panels is to precisely provide us with a perspective and can give rise to then articulation of an idea. We know that when ideas are put for negotiations, then it becomes difficult. And then, of course, one has to be very careful and very realistic. But this is not a moment when one would need to excel, let alone exaggerate with realism. Now, realism, of course, comes in necessarily. But, I mean, there is a time when one has to think one has to develop a vision. One has to think about a visionary approach which is needed. And we have heard in the panel many reasons for that. Now, of course, I suggested something that has a very high ambition level. And I know how difficult it is to go beyond what is fashionably termed in the United Nations as asylum mentality. Now, that terminology doesn't help us very much because it suggests a kind of a reality that there are silos. Well, I'm not so sure. Of course, in a way, there are silos. But we are here. I mean, the Commission for Social Development is here to go beyond that. And I think we have heard from all the panelists, that important emphasis on comprehensiveness and partnerships in developing and also in executing social policy. It's a very important realization. And I think the diplomatic processes should be very careful to take advantage of such insights that we get from panels like the one which we have been participating in this afternoon. So again, coming to the conclusion, I think we all understand that what we shall have to do is complicated, difficult, and everything, but let us be ambitious also. Madam President, I think this is a sentence with which I can then safely conclude my remarks and ask you to conclude the session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I think you have put it very well. I have noted this down myself. Progress is possible and the level of ambition should be very high. We fully agree with you on that. No doubt about that. May I thank you, as well as our distinguished panelists and all delegations for your participation in what turned out to be a very rich discussion. And thank you once again, Mr. Moderator, for your very wise insights. Colleagues, the Commission has thus concluded its program of work for this meeting. And before I adjourn, I would like to remind delegations that tomorrow at 10 a.m., the Commission will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 3A to hold a ministerial forum on the priority theme. I would also like to remind delegations that inscription for the list of speakers on e-delegate will close tomorrow, Tuesday, 6 February at 6 p.m. The meeting is adjourned.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
No, not.
I spoke to Israel after the meeting.